Hello everyone, welcome to Telerik UI for Blazor video series. My name is Fahad and I'll be going through some of the basic Telerik components in this video. I have 10 years of experience in .NET. I love learning about new technologies and recently I've started teaching programming online. You can find my YouTube channel or Twitter by googling Curious Tribe. You can also send me an email at curioustribe@gmail.com. This video is for people who are just getting started with Telerik components for Blazor. So first we'll add Telerik TextBox on our UI and we'll talk about some of the events like onChanged and valueChanged event so that you can have more control on your text box. Then we'll talk about how you can add drop-down list on your UI and how you can assign list of items to your drop-down list. We'll talk about how you can add templates to have custom UI for your drop-down list, and then we'll also check out some of the events so that we can have cascading drop-down list on our UI. We'll also talk about AutoComplete component where it gets easier for people to search through list of items. We'll talk about some of the filter operators so that user can search through list of items. Then we'll talk about MultiSelect component where you can select multiple items in your text box, and you can also have two-way binding for that component too. We'll also talk about some of the events like onChanged and valueChanged events so that you can have more control on the component. And then we'll talk about onRead events so that you can perform some of the server-side filtering. And finally, we'll talk about checkboxes where you can have indeterminate checkbox where your checkbox is neither checked or unchecked. You can have the value somewhere in the middle, and that way you can have good UI experience on your page. To get started using these components in your application, you can either try their free trials for 30 days or you can purchase developer's license of UI for Blazor. Once you do that, then you should download the installer, which will add all the NuGet packages and Visual Studio extension that you need to create Telerik project for Blazor. And that's what we're going to do in the next section. We'll create a new project, which will be Telerik project for Blazor. And then we'll talk about the demo app that we're going to use to add all the basic components in our project. Okay, so to create new Telerik project through Visual Studio, I'm going to open my Visual Studio and go to extensions, and you can see that this new extension added into my Visual Studio, and I can create a new Telerik project from here. I'm going to name my Telerik project as Bookstores application, because that's what the demo application is. And whenever I click on this create button, this will give me option to either create blank server application or blank WebAssembly application, or you can also create a server or WebAssembly application with some of the Telerik components added into them and CRUD operations as examples. So I'm going to select blank client application and click on finish. This will create a WebAssembly application with ASP.NET Core as backend. And if I open the project file for client, you can see that it already has the package reference for Telerik UI for Blazor. Okay. And if I go to my index file, you can see that we have already added a Telerik button as Telerik component onto page. So let's run this application and see how it looks like. I'm gonna go to my developer PowerShell and go to client folder and run my project from. I'm gonna say .NET Run. Copy this address, go to the browser and run my application. So you can see that this is just like any other Hello World application, but we do have this Telerik button added into our page. And whenever I click on it, it fires an event and shows a message. So this is how I created my demo application too, which is Bookstores application. But instead of using Telerik components, I use HTML controls. So let's first check out how the demo app is set up, and then we'll convert those HTML controls into Telerik basic components. Okay. Okay, so we will be using this application as a demo application for showing how you can use Telerik components in your system. This application is pretty simple. It's called as Bookstores app. There are two pages. One is author's page and another is publisher's page. On author's page, I'm taking author's information, author's first name, last name, city, state, book type, subscriptions. And whenever I save this information, it saves this in the database, and then I'm showing that information in an HTML table on the same page. And same I'm doing with publishers too. I'm taking publishers information, publisher name and the city. I'm saving that information in the database and showing it in an HTML table on the same page. Okay. But instead of using these HTML controls, what I would like to do, I would like to use Telerik components. I would like to use Telerik text boxes for taking users for author's first name and last name, so that user can have a good UI experience. I'm going to use Telerik's drop-down list for taking the city information, because so that I can have cascading drop-down list on my form. Whenever I select Philadelphia, it should load Pennsylvania as state. So we can achieve that by using Telerik drop-down list. Then I have book types, which is fiction and non-fiction for author, for taking author's information. But you can see that I can only select one type at a time. And then what I would like to do, I would like to change this drop-down into multi-select drop-down, which so that I can have both the book types option for the author's information that I want to save it in the database. I also have some checkboxes where I'm taking author subscription in bookstore, and I have gold plan, silver, and bronze. But you can see that whenever I select all, it doesn't select all the options. And this is something that we're going to achieve by using Telerik components. Okay, so before I start using Telerik text boxes, let's take a look at the code, and then we'll talk about how we can use basic components on our form. Okay, so for code, I'm gonna go to my Visual Studio, and code is pretty simple. I have author as model, and I have author list for showing author's information on the page, and on initialized, I'm initializing the model and the list, and then I'm loading authors, and you can see load authors getting called on initialized, which is getting all the authors from the system where I'm calling a service. It's making a web API call, and it loads all the authors. It orders it by descending and then shows it on the page. For showing it on the page, I have an HTML table. I have an HTML table which loops through author list for showing author's information on the page. Okay, so now for taking information, taking author's information, what I'm doing, I'm using an edit form, and in edit form, I am taking an input. I'm using HTML input tag for taking users author's first name, and I'm using author's last name, and I'm using some HTML controls for loading city, state, book types, and then I'm showing some checkboxes for showing the subscription for that author. And I have a save button and clear button. Save, whenever I click on save, create author gets called, which will create the author, which will call create author web API for creating the author in the system. So it's pretty simple application, and we'll be using Telerik components instead of using these HTML controls on our page. Okay, so in the next section we'll be talking about how we can use Telerik text boxes instead of using HTML text boxes on our form. Okay. Okay, so for using Telerik text boxes, what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna get rid of this input HTML tag. We don't need that anymore. Instead of that, we are going to use Telerik text box.
And I can assign an ID to my component. I'm going to say a TextBox first name. I can assign class to this component. So I can say form control, and I can assign width to it, which is column 4. I can also bind a property to this component so that whenever we save a record, we will have the value from this text box. I can assign a property from a model. Okay, let's run this and see how this looks. So I'm gonna say .NET Run, my browser, and you can see that now I'm using HTML control, but when I refresh my page, this will change to a Telerik text box component. Okay, there are some properties and events that are pretty cool with the Telerik text boxes. So let's go ahead and check that out. So there is this property called as enabled, which you can pretty easily set to true or false. So I'm going to say that I'm going to set to false and then stop the server and rerun it again. You don't really have to put if and conditions to not show your HTML. You can just set a property to true or false to that component to disable your control. So I'm going to refresh this page, and you can see that now my control is disabled. The best part about this property is you can map it to a function. I have already created a function called as set textbox access, which is currently returning true, but you can write any C# function here, which will return a boolean, and I can map that function to this enabled property. I can say that at the rate, and I want to call set textbox access, and that is returning true. So this way should get enabled again. So I'm going to stop this server again, rerun, and go back to my browser. And whenever I refresh this page, you can see that my text box is enabled again. So you can map your functions to your properties like enabled, your parameters enabled, and then that gets set to true or false depending on whatever you write in your C# functions. Okay, there is this event on change event, which is pretty cool. On change event gets fired whenever you lose focus of your text box, and if you want to handle those events, you can handle them too. So for that, what you can do, you can go and say that this is an on change event. This is an on change event. On change event, and here we'll have to map a function to this event so that that function gets called whenever on change event gets fired. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna go to my code here and say that I'm gonna create a property, create a function which is going to be private void, and I'm gonna say TextBox event handler, and I want this to get called whenever on change event of the Telerik text box gets called. Okay, so this function can take object as parameter, so I'm going to take object as parameter, and then we can convert this object into string. For doing that, let's create a property. I'm going to create a property called as textbox value, and we can assign this value, whatever is getting changed, this text box. So I'm going to say text box is equal to, first let's convert that object into string and say value. So whatever value is getting, say whatever value is there in the text box, that will get assigned to this property that we just created. Okay, so I'm going to map that function. I'm going to say that textbox event handler, and we would like to show that property too. So I'm gonna say div class column 4, and here I would like to show the text box value, which is getting changed whenever we lose focus of the text box. Okay, so I'm gonna go to my server, stop the server, run the server, go back to my browser and refresh my page. Now, when I type in John and lose the focus of the text box, you can see that it gets populated here. When I say Smith and put focus somewhere else, you can see that my text gets updated. So if that is something that you want to handle, in your code, you can handle that too. Okay, there is one more event that is pretty cool. It's called as value changed event. So I'm going to change on changed event to value changed event. And this event is pretty cool. This event gets fired whenever you hit a keystroke on your text box. So every keystroke, you can have control of your text box. Okay, so calling this event is a little different. So I'm gonna say that this is @ and I want to call a TextBox event handler, but I would like to pass a string value. So I'm gonna say string, and we will want to call TextBox event handler, and I'm gonna pass that value in here. Okay. And then what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna go to my TextBox event handler and convert this into string so that we don't get any error and we don't have to convert it anymore. So whatever value that we are entering into TextBox will get assigned to our property, TextBox value property. And then I'm gonna go and change. See, we cannot have value changed event and bind value at the same time. So for fixing that, what I'm going to do, I'm going to use value expression. So I'm going to use value expression, and for handling that, I'm going to say please map this to our author first name. Okay, so that should fix that problem. All right, let's stop this and rerun this again and see if we can put every keystroke of our text box. So I'm going to go back to my browser, refresh my page, and I'm going to say John Smith, and you can see that everything that I'm typing is getting recorded and it's getting assigned to whatever I'm typing in the text box. And that's pretty cool, right? So that's what I'm going to do for my last name too. And in the next section, we are going to talk about drop-down lists. We're going to talk about text box drop-down lists and how we can have cascading drop-down lists on our form. Okay. Okay, so before I add Telerik's drop-down list onto my page, I want to first talk about how this drop-down list is working on my page. So for that, let's go to our code and see that I'm adding this select HTML tag, and then I'm looping through list of cities where I'm adding options where the value is city ID and the text is city name. Okay, and if I go to the definition of the city, which gets created in our code where I'm creating instance of the city, and then on initialized, I'm calling load cities, which just adds cities into my list. You can also call web API here, but just for the demo purpose, I've added the cities into my list here. Okay, so instead of using this HTML drop-down list, what I would like to do, I would like to use Telerik's drop-down list. So let's go ahead and replace that select with Telerik's text box, Telerik's drop-down list. So I'm going to say Telerik drop-down list and set the ID to drop-down list for cities. And then I can set a CSS class. So I'm going to call it as form control and set column to 6 and column to 4 so that it looks nicer. And then I can I'll have to assign the property of my model that I want to bind it to. So I'm going to say bind value is equal to author.city. That's where it should get bound to. And finally, I will have to assign the data. So if I hover over data, you can see that it takes list of items. So I can assign cities to it. So cities is list of cities. Okay. But I don't want to show this drop-down list when there is nothing in the city. So let's put a if condition around it. So I'm gonna say if cities dot bound is greater than 0, then only show the Telerik drop-down list. Okay, so I'm gonna cut this drop-down, put it in the if condition, and I'm gonna press Ctrl KF to format the HTML here. Okay, let's run this and see how this works. So I'm gonna stop the client, run the client, go to the browser, and when I refresh the page, you can see that it's using the Telerik's drop-down list, but it's assigning the type of the name name of the type to as a drop down item. So what we can do to fix this problem, what we can do, we'll have to assign the text field and the value field to our drop down list. So for doing that, I'm gonna say this is the text field of the drop down list should be of type city dot city name, and the value field should be mapped to name of city.id. City.id. Okay, so this is where it should get mapped to. Value field. It should be value field. Okay, now let's run this and see how this is working. So I'm going to stop this, run this, and go to the browser. And when I refresh the page, now it should get populated. So if I open the drop down, you can see that it's loading all the items, all the cities that we are already loading into our list here. That's pretty awesome, right? So what I want to do now, I want to handle the on change event of this drop down. For doing that, you can go to your drop down and say that is there on change event? Yes, there is. So we'll have to create a method for this. So whenever an on change event gets called, I want to call that method and that will get called whenever the event gets fired. So let's go to my let's go to the code and create that event. So I'm gonna say that I want to create a method. I'm gonna create a method and I'm gonna call it as a drop down list event handler. And here I can you can pass the drop down list can pass a object as a parameter, which will be the value of the drop down list, and we can convert this into string. So let's create a property that I want to populate on the UI. So I'm gonna say this property is drop down list value, because that's what it is. So I'm gonna call it as drop down list value should get assigned to value. We'll have to convert this into string so that we can catch it. Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and call this event handler whenever an on change event gets called. So I'm going to say that drop down list event handler. Okay, and then I want to populate whatever is getting selected in the drop down onto the UI. So I'm going to add a div tag here and say that this is column 6, and here I would like to say that the drop down list value get populated here. Okay, so I'm going to stop the client, run the client, and go back to the browser and refresh the page. And now whenever I select an item, you can see that it selects the ID for that item. You can see that it selects the ID below this dropdown. So if I select Phoenix, you can see that it's selecting the ID. That's pretty cool, right? And you can do this by using value changed event too. Okay, so let's go ahead and use value changed event. I'm going to make this smaller so that it looks nicer. And then I'm going to change this on change event to value changed event. So I'm going to say value changed event. And for calling value changed event, I'm going to wrap this around @ and we'll have to use lambda expression. So I'm going to use lambda expression. And as we're using lambda expression, we can pass parameters in here. So I can say string value, we can pass value here. And same thing, I can pass it into my method here. This method doesn't really have to convert this value into object anymore, so we can change that. I'm going to say that this is string now, and then I don't want to convert this into string anymore. It is string already. And then I'm going to go back to my drop down list. As now I'm using value changed event, I cannot use bind value. I'll have to use value expression. So I'm going to use value expression instead of using bind value, so that my compiler is happy. So I'm going to say that to use value expression, which is going to be author city. Okay, sweet. Let's run this and see how this looks like. So I'm gonna stop the server, rerun it again, go to the browser, and I'm gonna refresh the page. And whenever I select Chicago, you can see that it's getting populated by using value changed event too. Nice, right? Okay. Now what I would like to do, I would like to populate the state whenever I select the city. So let's say if I select New York City, I want to select New York State. Whenever I select Houston, I wanted to select Texas in the list. Okay, so first let's go ahead and convert our drop down list into Telerik drop down list. For doing that, I'm gonna go to my code, and here we'll have to convert this this drop down list, which is list of strings, which is array of strings, and we'll have to convert this into Telerik drop down. So I'm gonna copy this if statement. Let's copy the if statement, and then replace this select tag here. And instead of saying states, cities, I want to say states. And let's compare length here because it's a string array. And then I'm gonna say that this is a drop-down list for states. We don't need a value expression. We can use bind value again. We'll use bind value and say that this is author state. I don't need to have a value field and the text field, so I'm gonna remove that because it's an array of strings. We don't really have to we don't have to tell the drop down list what is ID and what is value. It's all string, and I'm gonna remove this value changed event because we don't really need it on the state drop down list. Okay, so and let's change this data to states here. So I'm going to say states. So now whenever I run the refresh the page, it should load the states into my drop down list. But before I do that, what I want to do, I want to assign this author state in my drop down list event, so that whenever I select something in my cities, it will get populated. The corresponding state gets populated on this drop down. Okay, for that I'm going to go to that event, and let's first get the name of the city. Here we have the ID of the city. So for that, I'm going to say, let's create a string and say that selected city will come from all the cities, and where the city ID is equal to drop down list value, and I want to get the first or default, and then I want to get the name of the city. So I have already written a function. I have already written a method which is called as get state from the city, which takes the name of the city and returns the state. Okay, so I'm going to call this function to get the state by the city. So I'm going to set author.state, which we bound to our state drop-down list, and then I'm gonna call get state from the city and pass selected city into it. Okay, let's run this and see how this looks. So when I run this, go to my browser, refresh my browser, and whenever I select city, you can see that it selects corresponding state for that city. That's pretty awesome, right? That's pretty handy. Okay, so this is how you can have cascading drop-down list. One thing that I want to mention is, let's say if I say John Smith and save this record in the database, you can see that it doesn't take city into consideration when it saves the database. That's because it's not assigning the name author city whenever the model is getting sent to the database. For that, you'll have to select you'll have to set the author city into your drop down list event handler. That's where the event is getting called. So I'm going to say author city is equal to selected city and set that, and then I'm going to rerun this, refresh my page. I'm going to say John Smith, and I'm going to select Chicago, and when I hit save, now it saves the city. Okay, So that's something that I did it for TextBox too. So in the TextBox event handler, I set author's first name to get the value of the control. Okay. In the next section, I'm going to talk about templates. If you want to have customizable custom items into your dropdown, that's something that I'm going to talk about in the next section. Okay. Telerik's dropdown list lets you customize UI of your dropdown list by adding some templates into it. First, I'm going to add header template and show you how it really works. And then I'm going to add footer template, value template, and item template. Okay. So header template is nothing but a HTML render fragment parameter, which Telerik's dropdown list takes. So you can pass it as a header template into your dropdown list. And as this is a render fragment, I can pass any piece of HTML code. By default, it is empty, so you don't really see anything. But if you pass any piece of HTML code, it will be shown on top of the dropdown list. So if I say that it's H5, and I want to say these are the popular cities of USA, popular cities in USA. And I'm going to save my page and rerun my project. Go to my page, and if I refresh my page, in the drop-down list, you can see that the header text gets added on top of the drop-down list. And same thing that you can do with the footer template too. So if you want to add a footer template, you can say, I want to add a footer template and I want to show the same HTML. You can show different HTML too, but I'm going to show the same. And then I'm going to stop the project, rerun it, go to my page, refresh my page. And when I open my dropdown, you can see that I have some header template and footer template on my dropdown list here. Okay. Now I would like to customize the value template. So whenever I select the item, I want to put an ID of my city right in front of it. So for doing that, I'm going to add a value template. So I'm going to add a value template. And unlike header template and footer template, value template takes context name as parameter. So I'm going to pass it as city, and it knows what the context is from the list of the cities that we're passing. So city is the context. So if I want to access properties of city, I'm going to write some C# code. I'm going to say city.id dash city city name. Okay. And so whenever I select the item of my drop-down list, that should show the ID of the city in front of it. So I'm gonna select the city, New York City. You can see the ID right in front of it. If I select Houston, it's gonna show 4. If I select Seattle, it's gonna show 18. Okay. So instead of showing the ID of the city, I would like to show the state of the city right next to it. So you can call any C# function here too. For doing that, what I'm going to do, I'm going to put a comma and say @get state from the city. And here I can pass the city name to get the state. And if I pass that, stop my server, rerun it, and whenever I select the city, you can see the state right in front of it. So if I select Houston, you can see that it shows Texas. When I select Dallas, it shows Texas. It shows the state right in front of it. But what if I want to change the item instead of changing the value of the dropdown? For doing that, you can use item template, which is very similar to value template. The only thing which changes the item which are getting populated, that gets changed on the dropdown list. So I'm gonna copy the same text. I'm gonna copy the same C# code and put it here. And we don't really need to show the state on the value template because we're already showing which state it is on the other dropdown. So I'm going to get rid of that. Let's get rid of that. And then I'm going to stop the server, rerun it. And now if I select, you can see the item template, the items are showing the state in front of the city. Okay, and if I select the item, now you can see that it doesn't show the state in front of it because it's a value template, and I can see the state getting selected in my other dropdown. Okay, so that's how you can have header template, footer template, value template, and item template on your page, on your dropdown list, and customize your UI. In the next section, I'm going to talk about autocomplete dropdowns. So yeah, thanks for watching this one. Bye. Telerik's autocomplete text box lets you search through list of items. It has look and feel of a text box where you can bind list of items to it, just like you can do it to a drop-down list. So in this section, I'm going to convert my drop-down list for the cities into a autocomplete text box for cities. Okay. For that, I'm going to go to my code and remove this drop-down list. And instead of using the drop-down list, I'm going to use Telerik's autocomplete text box. And here I'm gonna say I can assign the ID to it. So I can say autocomplete cities. I can set a CSS class for it. I can say it's a form control. It's a form control, and I'm gonna set some width to it so it looks nicer. I can bind my model property to it. So I can say bind value is equal to author.city so that this is two-way binding. And I can assign my data to it. And if I hover over data, you can see that it takes list of items. So it can take list of cities. So I can say list of cities. And finally, we'll have to tell what's the text field, right? So, but if I look up a text field, you can see that we can't really find it. The reason why we can't find it is because the text and the value field for autocomplete is the same. So if you'll just have to assign value field for it. So I can say value field, and I can say name of city of city name, so that the city names of the city names from the cities get bound to my autocomplete text box. Okay, yeah, let's run this and see how this works. So if I refresh my page, and if I type in P, then you can see that it loads up Phoenix. It selects Phoenix in the drop-down list. If I type in PHI, then it selects Philadelphia. If I select Seattle, it goes to Seattle and selects that in my drop-down list. But what if I don't want to show the other cities which are getting loaded in the drop-down list? You can set that by setting filterable property. You can say that filterable is equal to true, and we don't want to see other cities in the drop-down list. Okay, so I'm going to stop the server, rerun it, refresh my page. And here, if I try to look up PH, then it only loads Phoenix and Philadelphia. If I type Seattle, if I type SE, it looks up for Seattle. Okay, but you can see that even if I type S, it loads all the cities which start with the letter S. You can also set minimum length for your text box search. For doing that, I can go to my Telerik autocomplete component, and I can say minimum length is equal to 2. So user will have to enter at least two letters in order to find something. So I'm going to stop the server. Let's save this first. I'm going to stop the server and rerun it. And I'm going to refresh my page. And here, if I type S, you can see that it doesn't really find anything. If I type P, it does not find anything. But if I type H, then it loads Phoenix and Philadelphia into my search results. Okay, you can do the same with SA too. It loads all the cities which start with the name SA. Okay, but I don't want to have only start with. I want to have contains. Like if I have AN in my search result, I still want Sant Antonio to get loaded into my list. And that's something that you can achieve by using filter operator. So you can say that we would like to have filter operator. filter operator, and if I hover over this filter operator, you can see that it takes Telerik Blazor string filter operator as parameter. So we'll have to define that property into our code. So I'm gonna go to my code, and here I can assign create a property which is going to be a string filter operator, and we can get and set this property. I can say get and set, and I'm gonna set it to string string filter operator. And if I you can see that I have some options. I can have contains with, does not, contains in, ends with. So you can select multiple options, and by default it is set to starts with. By default it is set to starts with, but you can change that to contains here. And once you do that, then you can assign the string filter operator to your autocomplete. You can say that string filter operator, we would like to use this. Let's run this and see how this works. I'm going to refresh my page. And here, if I type in SA, then it loads all the cities which have SA. If I type in Dell, it loads Philadelphia. If I type in TTLE, then it loads Seattle too. So it doesn't really have to start with the text. You can put any text which contains for that item too. Okay. I want to talk about two more properties here. One property is placeholder. You can have placeholder, and I can say that please select city, and that will be shown if there is nothing selected in the text box. And you can also set the clear button property to true and false. See, if I type in something here, I can clear that text by clicking on this. But if you don't want to give that feature to your user for some reason, you can set that to false too. You can say that it's false. And then let's run this and see if this is working or not. I'm gonna rerun this. Refresh my browser. And you can see that now I have placeholder, which is please select city. And I can type Dell, and you can see that it loads Philadelphia. You can see that the clear button is not showing anymore here. So if I go to my text box, there is no clear button here. Okay. You can set some event. You can set some event handlers for your Telerik autocomplete too. So what I want to do, whenever I select a city into my autocomplete city, I want my drop down to get loaded. Okay. So for doing that, I can set on change event for my Telerik autocomplete. So I can say that on change event. Uh, on change event, and this on change event is very similar to on change event of a text box. So whenever you either hit enter on your input control, or you lose focus of your input control, that's when this event gets fired. I don't want to assign value changed event which gets fired on every keystroke of the input control. Instead of that, because we don't want to look up for state on every keystroke, I want to look up for the state and load the state in the drop down whenever user selects an item into my autocomplete text box. Okay. And here I'm gonna call the same method, which is DropDownList event handler. And this is going to throw an error because it does not it does not pass string as an object. It pass object as parameter. And then we'll have to convert this into value. We'll have to convert this into string. So we can say string because it's passed as an object. And this is literally the text of the text box. You don't have to convert this into, you don't have to look up into the cities to find which city it is, what's the text of that city. You can comment this and get the city by the value. And we don't have to assign author city to selected city because the author city is already bound. We are not using value expression here. We are using on changed event. So if I do that, then it should load my state drop down list whenever I select something in my autocomplete. Okay, so let's save that, and then I'm gonna stop the server and rerun this. And if I refresh my browser, select something into the drop-down, and you can see the drop-down, select something in the autocomplete, and you can see that the drop-down gets loaded onto my form. Okay, I can also press CR, look up for Seattle, and Washington State gets loaded. I can look up for New York City, and the New York State gets loaded into the drop-down. Pretty cool, right? Okay, so now I want to talk about templates. Just like you can have templates into a dropdown, you can have templates for your autocomplete text box too. So for that, I'm gonna go to my dropdown here, autocomplete component here, and I can say that I want to pass header template. I can pass an strong HTML element and say that this should say top cities. I can also pass footer template, which is going to say strong total cities. So let's, I can also call a C# function, like I want to say cities dot count. I can do that too here. And unlike a drop-down list, we don't have like drop-down list, we don't have value template here. We have only item template, and that makes sense, right? Because there is no difference between text field and the value field. There's only one item, which is the string item, and I'm gonna select item template, and I can customize that too. We'll have to pass context name here, so I'm gonna city, and I can say @city dot city name, and I want to add the state of the city too. So for that, I'm going to call get state from the city, and here I'm going to pass the name of the city to get the state of the city. Okay, let's run this and see how this works. I'm going to refresh my page. And whenever I look up for a city, you can see that there is a header text and footer text, which is showing the count of the cities, and it shows item, and the item is the name of the city, comma, the state of that city. Okay, I can also look up for Seattle, and it shows the name of the city and the state of the city, San Jose and California. Okay. So yeah, that's all about autocomplete. In the next section, I'm going to talk about multi-select text box for these book types. Okay, bye. Telerik's multi-select component is kind of a combination of autocomplete and drop-down list component. The reason why I say that is because with multi-select, you can filter items just like autocomplete, and you can have text field and the value field just like drop-down list. So in this section, I'm going to convert my book types drop-down list into a multi-select drop-down list. And for that, I have added some extra items into my book types so that I can show some of the features that are there in multi-select drop-down. So let's go ahead and change this drop-down into multi-select drop-down. Before I change it to multi-select drop-down, I just want to talk a little bit about how this drop-down is set up. There is a HTML select tag where I'm looping through book types, which are loaded on initialized. And if you want to check book types class, it looks something like this. It has an ID and a type, and it's looping through list of book types, which I'm loading on initialize and creating the options where the value field is ID and the text field is type. And if I go and check the initialized method, I'm calling book types, load book types, and load book types is adding some book types to my list of book types. Okay. You can make a web API call to get the data, but I'm just adding here for the demo purpose. Okay, so instead of using this select tag, I want to use Telerik's multi-select drop-down list. Okay. So first I'm going to wrap it around an if statement, because I don't want it to show an empty multi-select drop down. So I'm going to say whenever book types count is greater than 0, then only we would like to show Telerik's multi-select drop down list. Okay, so for using that, I'm going to say Telerik multi-select drop down list. We can set an ID to it, which is going to be multi-select for book types. And then I can select a CSS class for it. So I can say class form control, and I can set width of my control. I can assign the data for my Telerik multi-select component. If I hover over this, you can see that it takes list of items. So I can assign my book types to it. So I can say data is equal to book types. So book types collection gets assigned to my multi-select drop-down list. And then we'll have to tell what is the text field and the value field. So for that, I'm going to say text field is equal to name of book type of type. That's where you should get the text from. And value field is going to be book types ID. So I'm going to say book type ID is going to be name of. Okay. And finally, I want to bind my value, whatever I'm selecting into my multi-select dropdown. I want to bind it to a property. But unlike autocomplete and drop-down list, multi-select takes multiple items into selection. So we'll have to bind a list of integer as its bind value. And the reason why I say list of integer is because the value field is an integer. It's an integer. So we'll have to create a property which will be bound to our multi-select component. So I'm going to say @bind value, and I'm going to create a property which is going to be selected book type. So let's go ahead and create that property into our code behind. I'm going to say I want to add a property which is going to be a list of integers, and the name is going to be selected book types ID. And I'm going to copy that and map it here. Sweet. So you can see that all the errors are gone. We can run this and we'll have Telerik's multi-select component. So I'm going to stop the server, rerun, go to my browser, refresh my page. And whenever I open the drop-down list, you can see that I can select multiple items into my text box now. It has a look and feel of a drop-down, but you can select multiple items into my text box. And the cool thing about this is, like, once you select the item highlights, so that you don't have to select it again. And then you can also remove these items. You can remove these items from the list too. Pretty cool, right? So like I said, we bound this item to this selected book types ID, and this is two-way binding. That means if I want to get items which I've selected in my drop-down list, in my multi-select drop-down list, I can get it from the selected IDs, which is list of integers, and populate on the screen. So what I would like to do, whatever I'm selecting, I would like to populate under my text box. This is what I'm selecting, so that I can show you can have access from the data which is getting selected in this text box. Okay, so for that, I'm gonna add some code here. I'm gonna add a code to show two-way binding. I'm gonna say that if selected book types ID count is greater than 0, so selected book types ID, the selection that we're doing, then I want to loop through it, and I want to take each an ID and then find the respective book type value for it, and then I want to separate it by comma and loop through it and show it on my screen. Let's see if how this works. So I'm going to stop my project, rerun it, refresh my page. So every time I select an item, you can see that it changes, it re-renders my page and shows the two-way bound list property, list of integers, and it shows the item that I'm selecting, and it's getting populated on the screen. So that way you can have control over whatever is getting selected into your drop-down list. Okay. Next, just like autocomplete, you can also have some properties, just like placeholder. You can set placeholder for your component. You can also make it as filterable to true. And just like autocomplete, you can have filter operator. You can also have minimum length, and that we talked about in our autocomplete component. So those are the properties those properties are also available for Telerik MultiSelect component. Now I want to talk about some of the events. So what I want to do, every time if I select more than 3 book types, I want to show a message saying that this is more than 3 books have been selected right next to in this section here. Okay. And you can achieve this use case by multiple ways, but I want to use on change event to achieve that. And Telerik's on change event gets fired whenever you select something into your item or you hit enter into your text box. So let's go ahead and check that event. I'm gonna go to my Telerik MultiSelect component and see if I have that event or not. I'm gonna say on change event. I do have it. And I'm gonna bind a method to this event so that it will show a message saying that whenever you select more than 3 items, it will show a message. For that, I'm gonna copy some code that I've already written. I'm gonna copy this code and put it here. It's pretty simple code. It says it's multi-select event handler. It takes object as parameter, and this object, unlike text boxes or drop-down list or autocomplete, this is going to be list of integers, because at a time you could have multiple items in your multi-select text box. So we will have to convert this object value into list of integers, and we can get it as selected IDs. And if this selected IDs are more than 3, then I'm showing message more than 3 books have been selected. We'll have to add this message. So let's go ahead and add that message as property. And what I'm saying is whenever the count is greater than 0, then I'm saying more than 3 book types have been selected. And let's populate that message right next to our list. So I'm gonna say here I would like to call message. And I want to map my event handler to on change event. So I'm going to say multi-select event handler, please get mapped to on change event. Okay, sweet. Let's run this and see how this works. I'm going to stop the project, rerun it, and I'm going to refresh my page. And every time I select, it's getting updated because it's two-way binding. And when I select the 4th item, it shows the message. You can see that it shows the message that 3 books types have been selected. And if I keep on selecting, it gets updated. You can see that when I remove the items, the message does not go away. The reason why that's happening is because the only time that on change event gets fired is when you enter something into your item. If you remove it, it doesn't update. See, I have the message. If I remove this, it does not get updated until and unless I click somewhere else, when I lose the focus of the text box, or I add an item which is not more than 3. Okay, so you can use value changed event, and value changed event gets called whenever you add or remove an item from this multi-select drop down list. So let's go ahead and try value changed event. So I'm going to change this on change event to value changed event. And for calling value changed event, I'm going to wrap this around @ so that I can make this as a lambda expression. And in this lambda expression, just like we were passing string as value, here we'll have to pass list of integer as value, and that value could be passed to our multi-select event handler. So I can say that this is take this as value, and we can't have bind value. We'll have to have value expression. So I'm going to add value expression, and I'm going to wrap it around @ and I'm going to map my selected book types ID to it. Okay. All right. Let's run this and see if the message gets updated on whenever we change the value of the multi-select. I'm going to stop the project, rerun it, go back to browse, and refresh my page. If I'm going to select more than 3 items first, and then that message will pop up. And whenever I deselect it, when I remove that item, you can see that the message goes away. So that's something could be done here too. And you can see that the items that we were showing disappeared. That's happening because we are using value changed event, and we'll have to assign our selected IDs into to our value. So if I say that selected book types ID is equal to selected IDs, and that way we can have two-way binding to it. Let's run this and see if this works or not. I'm going to refresh my page, and when I select something, you can see that it gets updated. My list gets updated, and whenever I select the 4th item, I see the message, and if I remove the item, the message goes away, and so does the text get updated here. Awesome, right? So that's all about on change and the value changed event. Last I want to talk about on read event. On read event gets called when you initialize your component and when you filter your text box. So this is something that you can use for making server side filtering. So let's go ahead and try to use that. So I'm gonna go to my multi-select drop-down list here, and here I'm gonna say on read event, and I want to map my load book types here. Okay, so that way whenever I load the multi-select drop down list, it will get the data from here. We don't have to use this piece of code anymore. I think we do have to use it. Let's see. So I'm going to say that on read event is going to be load types. So let's go ahead and call that. So if we are calling this on read, then we don't have to call it on our on initialized event. So I'm going to go to my on initialized event and comment this load book types here. Okay, so I comment that, then I'm gonna stop the server, rerun it, go to my browser, refresh my page, and here you can see that it's not showing. That's because we have that if condition. So let's go ahead and remove that condition. So I'm gonna go and remove this if condition and say that we don't need that anymore. I'm gonna format my HTML. Our multi-select drop-down list will get loaded on read event. So let's try to do that. So I'm going to refresh my page, and you can see that my drop-down list is getting loaded. Even if I'm not loading the book types on my on initialized event, it gets loaded on read event. But you have to be careful with this event, because this event gets fired every time you type in something into the text box. Let me show you. So for that I'm gonna create a property. I'm gonna create a property as count. I'm gonna say that this is an integer property, and I'm gonna call it as count. And this count, what I want to do, I want to check how many times this count is getting called. So I'm going to go to my load book types and say count plus plus. That means every time load book types gets called, I want to increase this count plus plus, and then I want to populate that count right next to my multi-select dropdown. So I'm going to say that div class column 4 load types load book types gets called at the rate count times. Okay. All right. Let's run this and see what happens. So if I refresh the page, and you can see that it says load types gets called one time. That means it called the list of items, how to load a list of items already. If I select something, nothing gets called. But if I type in something, see that number of letters that I'm typing, it makes call to the load book types method, so that you can filter your text box. The reason why we have this method is to have server-side filtering, and to get the input, you'll have to use MultiSelect read event handler. And let's go ahead and get that as parameter. You can go to your load book types and say that I want to have multi-select read event. So I'm going to say multi-select read event argument. And you can use some of the properties from this read event argument to filter your list that you're getting from the server. Okay, so for that, I'm gonna use filter descriptor, Telerik's data source filter descriptor, which looks something like this. So you get the request and the filters. First filter, get the filter descriptor, and from filter descriptor you can get the value which has been passed and the operator that you want to pass to your server for filtering your list in the drop down list. Okay, and yeah, that's all about multi-select drop down list for Telerik. In the next section, I'm gonna talk about Telerik checkboxes. So yeah, see you soon. Bye. For Telerik's checkbox demo, I've added some checkboxes on my page. Those are subscriptions for the author. So author can select all of them or some of them as checkboxes and save in the database. Whenever I select these checkboxes, you can see that these values are getting updated. These are the values which are two-way bound on UI. So whenever I select, they get updated. But these are HTML checkboxes. Instead of these, I would like to use Telerik's checkboxes. So first, let's see how these checkboxes are set up, and then I'll convert them into Telerik checkboxes, okay? So if I go to my code, I'm looping through subscription, which is list of subscription. If I open this class, then you can see that it has an ID, subscription name, and selected as Boolean property. And if I go back, then you can see that I'm looping through the subscriptions which are loaded on initialized method. If I open on initialized method, I'm calling load subscription. And in the load subscription, I'm adding gold, silver, and bronze as subscriptions, okay? And those are getting, I'm looping through them and creating some HTML, which is label, and it has checkbox in it, which is bound to the selected property of subscription. And I'm showing the subscription name, and the same property I'm populating right next to it. So whenever I select something, this gets updated, okay? But instead of using this, I would like to use Telerik checkbox. So I'm gonna get rid of this input tag, and instead of that, I'm gonna say I wanna use Telerik's checkbox. I can assign ID to it. I can say checkbox for subscriptions, and then I can bind the value to it just like I did it for HTML control. So I can say that bind value to subscription selected. So whenever I select the subscription, this will get updated. Okay, let's run this and see how this looks. I'm gonna refresh my page. And now you can see that these are Telerik checkboxes. Whenever I select, it has that orange, nice looking background, and my two-way binding works just fine. Okay. So now what I would like to do, I would like to convert my all checkbox into a Telerik checkbox. And whenever I select all, I want all of these to get selected. And whenever I select all of these, my all should get selected. Okay. So that's something that we're going to do. For that, I'm going to go to my code here. And I don't want to use HTML checkbox. Instead of that, I would like to use Telerik checkbox. So I'm going to use this label. I'm gonna keep the label as same, but I'm gonna add a Telerik checkbox instead of adding instead of adding a HTML checkbox, and I'm going to name it as ID. ID is equal to checkbox all, and I'm going to bind this to a property. And this property, we would like to set this property. Whenever we set this property, I want to set all the properties, all the selected properties for all the subscriptions. And whenever the selected property for all the subscriptions are set, then I want to get that property and bind it to this Telerik checkbox. Okay, so let's go ahead and first create that property. So I'm going to go to my code here, and I'm going to create a property. I'm going to create a property called as it's going to be Boolean property, and I'm going to call it as select all. And whenever we set this property, I would like to set all the subscription to true. So I'm gonna say that whenever you set the property, let's do one thing. Let's say subscription for each. All the selected property should set to whatever is getting selected in that checkbox. So I'm going to say sub dot selected is equal to value, and that's what should happen whenever you set that property. And whenever it comes to getting that property, I'm gonna say that any of the all of the subscriptions, whenever all the subscriptions selected property is set to true, that's when I would like to set this property to true too. So I'm gonna say return subscriptions, and when all the subscriptions have selected property set to true, all the subscription have selected property set to true or false, that's what I would like to assign it to my checkbox, my select all checkbox. So I'm gonna assign this property to my checkbox here. I'm gonna say that bind value checkbox for all. I'm gonna say select all. That's the property I would like to set, and then I'm gonna rerun this again and see how it works. I'm gonna refresh my page. And whenever I select all of them, you can see that all get selected. Whenever I unselect it, all gets unselected. Whenever I select all of the items get selected. When I unselect all of the items get unselected. That's pretty cool, right? Another cool thing about Telerik checkboxes is its indeterminate value. That means if I select one of them, I want to say that, okay, it's neither checked or unchecked. There is another state for this checkbox, which is indeterminate. That means it's somewhere in the middle. And that's something that I would like to set whenever I select some of the subscriptions for my author. Okay, for setting that, you can set that by setting parameter indeterminate. So I'm going to go to my checkbox here and say that indeterminate, I would like to set that property. And this property will be true when some of the items are selected, but not all of them. So for that, I'm going to create a property and call it as Boolean. And this is going to be select all indeterminate. Select all indeterminate. And here I would like to only get the value. I'm not going to set the value. Now I'm going to set the value, and here I want to say that get this value when select all is false. So I'm going to say whenever select all is false, that means all the items should not be selected. And we want to set this property when some of the items are selected. So I'm going to say subscription, any of the item, if any of the item is selected, then we would like to set this property to true. So I'm going to say subscription and selected, any of the properties. Okay, and we can bind this to our checkbox. So I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to bind it to my indeterminate property here. Once I do that, I'm going to stop the project and rerun it. I'm going to refresh the page. And when I select the all, you can see all of the items are getting selected. When I unselect the checkbox, all of them are getting unselected. But when I select one of them, you can see that it has that nice orange background, which is telling you that, okay, not all of the items are selected, but some of the items are selected. Okay, I thought that was pretty cool about Telerik checkboxes, and I wanted to show you. Yeah, that's all about all the basic components, and I'll see you in next slide. Bye. Thanks for watching this video. If you have any questions, you can reach out to me or ask questions in the comment section. If you want to have access to the source code, you can get the link in the video description. And please go ahead and try Telerik components today and let us know your feedback. With that, thanks for watching this video. Bye.